So this is a video I've kind of been toying with for a while, and I've made a few videos kind of dancing around this topic, but in this video I'm going to explain why I think Gen Z is falling, why it's in decline, and what some of the biggest problems in the world are right now. Sorry, that was me shutting my window so that nobody hears what we're talking about. But in this video, we're going to talk about basically three things. What is to blame, who's to blame, and is there any hope for the future? And all of this is going to basically be centered around what I think are the big problems, particularly with Gen Z, why people are so unhappy, so unhealthy, so pathetic, I think, is a very emotive word, but it's probably true. I think people my age, from what I see, are quite honestly pathetic in many different ways. And so that's what I'm going to talk about in this video. If you're new to the channel, I make videos that improve people's lives. Hit the subscribe button and let's go. So first of all, what is to blame? I'm going to call all of these things modern vices, and obviously I'm going to go through and explain them. But I think the reason people are so kind of weak and unproductive these days is because of modern vices that either didn't exist previously, or they did exist previously and they now exist in a much more palatable and harmful form. I'll give you a few examples with like food and stuff in a second, but all of these things are basically working to destroy very important things like health, productivity, ambition, socialization, and more. If you look at if you're around 18 years old, maybe, is probably the perfect age to be watching this, but honestly, anyone can benefit from this. If you see people anywhere between 14 to honestly like 30, or sometimes like even past that, 35, a lot of them are just doing absolutely nothing productive with their spare time. I know I see people on break at my work, and more often than not, they're just doing completely unproductive things. They're swiping on TikTok or something, and they're, eating something unhealthy, and they're just doing absolutely nothing. And it's no wonder people are so unhappy these days, why they can't focus these days, why they're so unhealthy, why they can't socialize with people. It's because of all these things that I'm about to talk about, and it's just so widespread and no one's addressing it. So that's what I think it's really important to address that in this video. So the first thing that is to blame for people being so unimpressive and subhuman these days is a very, very steep exponential rise in instant gratification. So if you don't know what instant gratification is, I have talked about it a little bit, and I think a few other people have in the self-improvement space, particularly on YouTube. But instant gratification is basically anything that gives you the kind of benefit of it immediately. So if we think about things like junk food, obviously we know that there really isn't a benefit to eating it. It's not a good thing. But when I say benefit, I mean what's in the pros column. Like, obviously everything you do has a pro and a con. If you eat junk food, yes, it's bad, but I guess the pro is that it feels good in the moment. That's why people do it. And that would obviously make it instant gratification, because the only benefit is that it kind of feels good now. Everything else about it is bad. It makes your life worse. It makes you unhealthier. It destroys your focus. We could be here all day talking about the negative sides of junk food, but that's an example of instant gratification. And there's a ton of other forms of instant gratification. For example, social media, short form content, any kind of like Netflix or any kind of streaming service that didn't exist before. There's many, many more. You could probably think of many more, some specific ones, maybe online shopping, maybe it literally could be many, many things, but there are way more. Anything to do with comfort or any kind of comfortable distraction is probably a form of instant gratification. And because if you live in a Western country, it's basically the most comfortable it's ever been. It's pretty easy to be distracted by these things and to have them ruin your life. And I think a lot of people, if we go back to that example I gave just before with people, on break at work, when they could be using that time to be productive, they're instead, eating junk food and swiping on looking through short form content on some social media app. They're doing like 3 or 4 things at the same time, instant gratification things. And that's so bad for you, as we'll talk about in a second, but it's destroying your focus. It's destroying your ambition to do stuff, because when you're surrounded, even if you don't like your life, if you're surrounded by some level of comfort, it's very easy to just do nothing, because even though you don't like a lot of stuff, it's just comfortable enough to not change. The benefit of having a bad life previously, before everyone had a phone in their pocket and that kind of thing, was that if your life was uncomfortable, there were way less things to distract yourself with, and so you basically had to improve your life. I can't remember the scientific name for it, but there's a name for when instead of having a 4 out of 10 experience, you have a 1 out of 10 experience, and that actually springboards you into doing something that then elevates your life into, you know, an 8 out of 10. Whereas nowadays, because we're at kind of like a 4 out of 10 for most people, they can't bother to change because it's not uncomfortable enough to get that springboard, if that makes sense. But that's a little bit on instant gratification, and we'll talk about who's to blame for that on the next slide. But just to sum up number one, because it is the most important one here, instant gratification is anything that kind of feels good now but isn't good for you. There's way more of these things that they're distractions, they're unhealthy, and they're very, very kind of seductive. They're very, very easy to do because they're pleasurable activities, but they aren't good for you. And we have really no training in either school, with the exception of, I guess there's some training on alcohol and drugs, but that's not even the big deal. We don't have like a country of people doing heroin. We have a country of people on TikTok and stuff that are doing absolutely nothing with their lives, and that, as far as I know, isn't being addressed in school. So that's number one. The second thing we're going to talk about for what's to blame, and I'll try and move through these more quicker and quicker as we go, because I've put them in a rough order of importance, not really. Some of them are a bit out of order. But anyway, the second thing we're going to talk about is an attack on discipline, and specifically our culture and society's understanding of mental health, because I think in a lot of ways it's extremely, extremely bad, and it actually makes the problem worse. So I'm not sure which decade exactly this started in, but we've kind of moved into a bit of a softer culture where we're trying to encourage crying, particularly for men, and we're trying to encourage emotional maturity, and I'm doing like air quotes there, you can't see me, as being basically soft. And you'll understand where I'm going with this in a second, but our modern understanding in Western countries of mental health is basically for people to take it easier, to, when they feel like doing things, to do it, to cry, to obey their emotions, and to basically indulge in whatever pleasure they think they feel. And we view instant gratification, anything that gives you dopamine, as a good thing, and that those things give you happiness and that kind of thing. And 70% of what I just said is nonsense. The only part of what I just said that I think is accurate is a better understanding of emotions. But even then, I think modern culture has it wrong, because you shouldn't obey your emotions blindly. You should listen to your emotions more, which I think is a good thing. But true emotional mastery is the ability to listen to your emotions and make the best decision possible without always obeying them. And that's, I think, something we've forgotten. So when I say poor mental health understanding, I basically mean we don't really have any solution to poor mental health. The best our society can give in regards to people who, and by the way, we're in like the worst state of mental health we've ever been in like the big Western countries like Australia. Australia's not big, but you know what I mean. Australia, America, England, Canada, New Zealand, and probably most of Europe, countries like that, we have the worst mental health and the worst health we've ever seen, and yet supposedly we have the best mental health understanding. Like, it doesn't make any sense that we would be so arrogant to think that we know more than anyone else about mental health, and yet we have the worst mental health ever. Like, that's kind of weird, isn't it? But anyway, we have our understanding of mental health is clearly flawed, and I'll explain why. We basically attack discipline and any kind of, aggression, toxic. We call it toxic, and we use these silly buzzwords when it comes to people being disciplined and that kind of thing. Here is my understanding of mental health, and I made a full video on it, which I'll link below, which you should definitely check out. But basically, the key to better mental health, the first thing you need to do is to understand emotional mastery, because any mental health problem has an emotional component to it. And I think our understanding of emotional mastery is basically to obey your emotions. That's a terrible idea. What you should do, the person who has true emotional mastery, and I've kind of waffled a little bit on this one, but I'll wrap it up quickly. The person with true emotional mastery is the person who can listen to their emotions, understand where they come from, and then make the best decision possible without necessarily obeying all their emotions. They obey the emotions that are good for them, and they disobey the emotions that encourage them to do bad things. It's too complicated to talk about a lot in this video, so I'd encourage you check out my full video on it after this video. But basically, to sum up number two, we have kind of a culture that attacks discipline, calls it toxic. We attack ambition. We think it's bad for people to want to be better, to look better, to make more money, to do all these things, and it's just a very bad culture in that regard. But moving on to number three, which is related, weakness culture. This is kind of an elaboration on what I just talked about. I was more focusing on discipline and mental health. These days, we very much have a weakness culture where any kind of self-improvement and stuff, I think, is largely discouraged. We're told not to be arrogant, and you definitely shouldn't be arrogant in the sense that you're thinking you're better than everyone and, not listening to people when you really should be listening to people. But I think there's definitely something to be said for having a very high having very high standards and expectations and ambitions for yourself. And if you work hard toward those things and sacrifice, a lot of modern culture would criticize you for that. And I don't think there's anything to criticize for someone who wants to, delay gratification in all regards, never eat unhealthy, always exercise, always work on their goals. I think that's an excellent thing to do. And I think a lot of people would criticize you for that. So that's a little bit on weakness culture. The fourth thing is widespread purposelessness. I think a lot of people in our generation, in my generation, I don't know how old you are very much purposeless. They don't have a clear purpose to work on. And there's a few reasons for that. One is that the scope of things you can pursue in your life is the widest it's ever been. If you think about the 1800s, if you lived on a farm, the amount of exposure you had to the outside world was very, very small, and it largely started when you were old enough to actually leave where you lived, which was probably not until you're a teenager. These days, 5-year-olds have iPads and access to the internet, and we have exposure to the entire world, and we have so much room to do stuff, and yet our education in school for how to pursue purpose and that kind of thing hasn't really changed. In fact, I think it's probably gotten worse. I think the education we receive at the moment is absolutely terrible. So the juxtaposition, the comparison between the opportunities we now have and the education we receive is so big that I think it has resulted in widespread purposelessness. Plus, people are obviously distracted with instant gratification, as we talked about. So most people have no real reason to pursue any kind of purpose because they're somewhat comfortable where they are now, and I think that's really bad. But yeah, that's widespread purposeless. People just really have no ambition these days, and the word agency basically means you having control over your life, and I think people largely, a lot of the time, don't really believe they have that much control over their life. They think they're kind of stuck where they are, and they kind of have to be pushed around by life randomly. And I don't think that's true. Once you accept that you have complete control over your life, I think your life gets a lot better. But number 5 is lower quality relationships. This one's pretty straightforward. We have, less families, more like damaged families than ever before. We have worse relationships with other people because of social media, etc. So I think lower quality relationships is pretty much a given. Although we have more contact on social media, which has the potential to be a plus with people we might not see in person, I think overall relationship quality has gone down. The 6th thing is severely impacted health. I think people are obviously more unhealthy than ever these days. That one's pretty obvious. I don't really need to go into. We have, the worst diet ever and the worst mental health ever, as I've already kind of talked about a bit. So that's another thing. And then 7 is the elimination of values. I think this one is quite complicated, but I do think we've very much embraced individualism as a society, and I think there's good parts to that, in that you should be on your own team, and you should make sure you're constantly improving as a person. The problem is that that's not really how individualism works in modern society. People aren't really improving as people. It's more about trying to indulge in as much comfort and kind of hedonism and degeneracy as possible, instead of improving yourself, and that's a really bad form of individualism. So that's another thing that I think is bad. But now that we've kind of gone through all the problems, and it might have got a little bit boring to the end, but I promise it's going to get more interesting in a second. Now that we've gone through all of the main modern vices that are causing people to, be worse people effectively, let's discuss where they actually come from, because I think this is really interesting. The number one biggest issue, and I think people tend to downplay this, is culture. Everything is downstream from culture. So when we talk about, for example, an unhealthy diet that most people have, I think a lot of people are quick to blame like the big businesses and stuff for manufacturing, more and more unhealthy things that are very, very edible. And that's definitely true, but I don't think it's the main thing. The thing about business and about any other institution in society is that generally they're not the instigators. They make things based on what the culture demands. And I'll give you an example to prove it. Prohibition, which basically, if you don't know what prohibition was, it was basically alcohol was banned. In America, for example, in the this was ages ago. It was the 18th Amendment to the Constitution, I'm pretty sure. They banned alcohol, and it's widely considered as a failure because they overturned it and then they brought back alcohol. Obviously, you can drink alcohol in America today, but it didn't work when they tried it. They tried to pass a law and it didn't work. And so people nowadays say, oh, you can't have prohibition, that just doesn't work. That's not true. If you look at some countries in the Middle East, for example, where there's very, very low alcohol consumption, it actually does work. And so people are like, well, why did prohibition fail in America, but it works in, Middle Eastern countries, Muslim countries where people might not drink as much alcohol? And the answer is, I think, pretty obvious, which is culture. There's a different culture. In a culture where everyone wanted to drink and liked drinking, that law didn't work, and it does work in cultures where people don't do that. So that shows that culture is actually the instigating factor. If we lived in a culture where it was totally unacceptable to play video games, for example, video game companies would not make as much money, and they would probably go bankrupt for the same reason that, you know, I've never actually verified this, but I presume there aren't many companies that sell like pork and ham in Muslim countries, for example, because they obviously, it's just not going to work, you know what I mean? So culture is kind of the instigating factor when it comes to any other institution that makes life worse for people. So whether it's school teaching things that aren't particularly useful, whether it's the government laying down laws that people don't like, whether it's social media profiting off the kind of content people want to watch, whether it's business manufacturing things that aren't particularly good for us as a society, but they make a lot of money. All of these things are downstream from culture because, again, if it wasn't culturally acceptable, if people didn't accept that as in their national identity or anything like that, these things just wouldn't make money. They wouldn't be popular. They wouldn't be allowed. Because the people would effectively say no. And I've just given an example of how that is the case. So culture is the first thing. Everything is downstream from culture. And unfortunately, we do have a weakness culture at the moment, which is what I discussed before. It's encouraged by government, by school and social media, but culture is effectively the instigator. We as a society are, you know, we indulge in comfort. We've told each other, you know, ridiculous lies about physical health and mental health that I've just kind of gone over. And yeah, that's one of the biggest problems at the moment. Another big problem with who is to blame is, I think, school. So school, I think, teaches kids not to value learning. And this is a really interesting one because a lot of people would say school does teach to value learning, but it doesn't matter what the intention of something really is. What actually matters is the reality. And the reality is that most kids in school do not enjoy learning at all. They don't see the value in learning. And learning is effectively a form of self-improvement. And school is kind of a combination of teaching things that aren't particularly useful to people a lot of the time, and then also teaching and then also conditioning people. Sorry about the audio for a second. Also conditioning people in school to not actually value their own learning. And so what happens is they miss out on crucial skills in school and then they fail to learn them after school as well, which means they don't really know that much stuff and they also don't want to learn anymore, which is, I think, a really bad combination. And then finally for this section, social media / short form content, as we already discussed, is a huge distraction. It destroys mental health. It destroys focus, as anyone who's, done a dopamine detox, like I've already made a video on, where they stop consuming, social media and short form content for a little bit, and they find that they actually are way more, they can concentrate way more on reading and other low dopamine activities. And I think when this kind of stuff is in your life, it's very difficult to concentrate on other things. And it also creates a very unhealthy comparison. I think when you're from a young age exposed to kind of, people who've exaggerated their lives, maybe they are living very good lives, but they've exaggerated them even more. And then in your life, you're not really taught how to get there. And you're also, maybe you don't know any of those people in real life. I think what actually happens is you start to see those people as other and yourself as different from them, in that you can never actually reach that level. And that kind of unhealthy comparison is, I think, not good for people. So that's what is to blame and who's to blame. Is there hope for the future? Absolutely, mate. I think there is hope for the future. People are really starting to wake up to all the things I've mentioned in this video, and they're starting to realize that instant gratification and everything else is really making people's lives worse, not better. And it's still nowhere near a majority, but I think it is, it's getting louder and louder each year with, I think online communities have been great for that. With, even though social media is, I think, largely bad, that it's been good for people kind of understanding how bad a lot of things are and being louder than they otherwise would be because they're able to connect online. So I think people are supposed to be healthy and filled with purpose and constantly improving themselves. And when they're not, they're distracted by comfort and they're attacking themselves. So if you have liked this video, 2 actionable steps I'd give you is a dopamine detox. I'll link my video as well on that in the description. It's basically where you cut out a bunch of unhealthy habits and you reset your ability to focus and become a better person because of it. And the second thing I'd recommend you do is to set goals to actually have something to start working on, which I'll also link below. But guys, that is the video. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, definitely hit the subscribe button, because these are the kind of videos I make. And I've taken a bit of a break from YouTube, but these are the things I'm going to continue to talk about and make more videos on. But that is the video. Thank